He is the COO of PayPal. He is also a partner at Craft Ventures in Silicon Valley, and he is the co-host as well of the very successful podcast, the All In podcast. David Sachs on the Will Cain Show. Hey, David.
Hey, Will. Good to see you.
So I was excited to talk to you today. I mean, you have been very, very outspoken when it comes to Ukraine, and I in my introduction, David, I said, look, you're kind of in many ways you're singing my tune. Like I'm naturally gravitating to your position, but I didn't really want to have a half hour, 40-minute conversation with you where you and I just high-fived in agreement about Ukraine. And I don't think that's your nature either. I'm a fan of the All In podcast. So, I did ask, for example, my co-host Brian Kilmeade, like, I feel like, David, for actually like the dozenth time, make me the best argument for your support of the war in Ukraine. And it always starts here. And so we need to start with this. And I'm going to put his position to you. And I know you're well versed in it, so you'll be ready to respond. But the position of almost every hawk is Putin will roll through Eastern Europe. He will roll into NATO countries. He will roll into Poland. So if you do not make a stand in Ukraine, you sacrifice Eastern Europe.
That's the argument. I mean, this is the Putler argument, and I think this is the argument that the Speaker of the House believes, and a lot of hawks believe this, and there's simply no evidence for it. I mean, it's a completely made-up, puffed-up threat. The person to listen to on this is Professor John Mearsheimer. He's done a ton of work on this, and there is no evidence to support this idea. Moreover, there's inherently a contradiction, because we say, on the one hand, that we need to bring Ukraine into NATO in order to protect it, because we know that Putin would never invade a NATO country. And then on the other hand, we say that if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he's going to attack all these NATO countries. So which one is it? I think that it makes no sense. It would make no strategic sense for Putin to attack NATO countries. And the origins of this war have everything to do with the specific circumstances of Ukraine. Since the 1990s, we've had a debate over NATO expansion, and we knew eminent foreign policy scholars and statesmen like George Kennan, like Bill Bradley, like Sam Nunn, they all knew that bringing NATO right up to Russia's border would provoke a hostile response from Russia. And our CIA director, Bill Burns, knew it in 2008 when he wrote the famous memo, Niet means Niet, saying that if we announce our intention to bring Ukraine into NATO, it would provoke a hostile response from the entire Russian elite, not just Putin. And yet, as soon as this war began, we conveniently forgot the whole history of this conflict and this debate. And so there are well-understood reasons for this war in Ukraine that everyone's just ignoring. And instead, they've made up this fantasy that Putin just woke up one day and, and kind of went crazy and became a madman in the vein of Adolf Hitler. And it's just not true. There's a long history of this conflict that is readily available if you're willing to look, even at the media coverage in 2021, which was far more honest about it.
And we've had some of those conversations. We've done some of those historical deep dives here on the Will Cain Show, David, about, the relationship over Ukraine to Russia dating back. And by the way, that's what Putin immediately goes to deep history when he talks about that area of the world in their relationship to Russia. So, but I want to take this piece by piece. So, okay, so I know that their argument, again, I'm trying to play devil's advocate and steel man their argument. So they would say in response to what you just said, well, Putin is already attempting to reestablish the Soviet sphere of influence throughout former Soviet bloc countries. So not all through hard power like he's doing in Ukraine, but through soft power. Georgia, pretty successful, you would argue, in Belarus, and at least bringing it under the sphere of influence of Russia. And so he is already active in Eastern Europe, in the former sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, in encroaching upon NATO. Now, David, I did say, well, wait a minute. That's not NATO. So are we to fight back on Putin even interfering in elections in Georgia? But their point to me is his motivations of expanding the Russian empire are made clear not just in Ukraine.
Well, the only other example they can really point to of Putin being an aggressor is the 1 week invasion of Georgia back in 2008. And if you read the EU Commission's own fact-finding report on that, as I have done, the EU concludes that it was Georgian President Saakashvili who started the hostilities by shelling the sort of Russian enclave of South Ossetia. I think it was on the night of October 7th and October 8th of 2008. And so Putin moved in response to that, and he was very eager to work out a ceasefire. The conflict only lasted a week. If he had really been the aggressor that everyone talks about, why wouldn't he have moved his tanks on Tbilisi? He didn't do that. That conflict was provoked by Georgia. Now, so that's the only other example that people can give of Putin being an aggressor. Yes, there was the Chechen conflict, but that is a conflict that was within Russia. He was dealing with extremist separatists within his country, and I think that most countries would have reacted in a similar way. So, and then the other, that's the last final example that they sometimes give of Putin being an aggressor, is Russian involvement in Syria. But Putin was invited in to Syria by the internationally recognized government of Assad. So there's simply, when you actually start to examine the case for Putin being an aggressor, it really falls apart. Now, in terms of the Russians wanting a sphere of influence in their backyard, I suppose that there's some truth to that, but that doesn't mean Russian domination of these countries in the manner of the Soviet Union. What was Russia looking for in Ukraine? They were looking for neutrality. They simply wanted Ukraine to remain neutral. And the deal that Ukraine could have made before the war or at Istanbul in the first month of the war is to officially declare neutrality, to say that it would not join NATO, and to respect the rights of the Russian speakers in the Donbass, give them the semi-autonomy that had already been agreed to by Ukraine under the Minsk agreements. And if Ukraine had done that, there would be no war today, and Ukraine would have lost no territory. But that was not good enough for the West. It was the West who came in via Boris Johnson and said, we want to pressure Putin, not make peace with him. And that's why the peace agreement at Istanbul was rejected, and that's why the war continues to rage to this day.
Okay, I want to come back to Ukraine for just a moment, but what we're doing is we're trying to understand the motivations of Putin, because the Hawks' point of view is you have to stop this before it metastasizes. Their point of view is that Putin has bigger ambitions than Ukraine, and if you do not stop him in Ukraine, then you will open the door to further aggression. Now, you defined aggression just now as direct military aggression. You pointed out Syria, Chechnya, Georgia. Now, again, whether or not he's attempting, however we define sphere of influence, the purpose of this part of the conversation is to try to understand his motivations, right? Because that seems to be the core of the debate that's being had. Now, they would say, well, he's interfering in elections in Lithuania right now. They would point out to other soft power, perhaps not military aggressions, but soft power efforts to reestablish his dominance over that region. And they would say that points to his motivations that you should be very skeptical towards and make your stand in Ukraine.
Well, I think the first point to make here is just to ask, what's in Russian interest? Russia is already the largest country in the world by land mass. It has massive natural resources. It has no desire to conquer other peoples that would be incredibly hard to subdue and rule. You remember when the Soviet Union ran Eastern Europe after World War II, it was constantly dealing with uprisings. Let's see, I'm going to forget some of them, but in 1956, you had the uprising in Hungary.
Right.
In 1968, you had the Prague Spring. In 1982, you had Solidarity in Poland. And I don't think that Russia wants to be in the position anymore of trying to subdue these Eastern European countries. It's kind of been there, done that, and they don't really have the capability to do that. They're not as powerful as the Soviet Union once was. Moreover, they have all the land they need. They have all the resources they need. There'd be nothing in it for them. And if you look at the history, if you just look at Russian history compared to European history, Russia was never an imperial power or colonial power. It never went abroad in search of overseas colonies. What it did do was look inward. It basically tried to incorporate Siberia into the they tried to bring the country closer together by creating the Trans-Siberia Railroad across the whole country. So what you see is a pattern that when the great European powers engaged in colonialism, Russia looked inward to sort of conquer its own internal landmass and achieve mastery over its own resources. So what I would argue is that this view of Russia as this imperialist colonialist power is really a projection of Europe's own history onto Russia. And Russia has behaved quite differently.
Well, this might be a place where I do have some earnest disagreement with you. In other parts, I'm playing devil's advocate. But and this will be a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. I do think the history, and I'm not an expert, but I am decently well read on it. I do think that history shows that Russia has some paranoia about invasion from Europe. And you could say, well, that's the Europeans' provocations of imperial reaches. But whether or not chicken or egg, Russia does feel vulnerable from invasions from the east, short march to Moscow, if you don't have Belarus, maybe Poland, standing in between you and Napoleon, you and Hitler, who've made those marches into Russia. And so there has been some history to suggest they want that buffer zone between themselves and Russia, and they would be, no matter how big they are geographically, they'd be more secure with that sphere of influence in those countries in the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think that Russia, above all, wants secure borders, and that is because of their history. Like you said, Napoleon made it all the way to Moscow. They only defeated him through the scorched earth policy, where they lit Moscow on fire. Hitler, you're right, attacked Soviet Union. I think something like 27 million Russians died, something like 1 out of every 7 Russians. So they have this history that they remember well, and they have been invaded, over throughout their history, and those invasions have often come from Ukraine. So there's no question they want secure borders, but the question is, could that have been managed through a security architecture that actually took their concerns into account? They weren't saying that they had to subjugate Ukraine or Belarus or the Baltics or anything like that. What they wanted was for Ukraine to be neutral. And again, I maintain that we could have addressed what I think are natural and legitimate Russian security concerns through, again, a security architecture. We've exacerbated those concerns by bringing our military alliance right up to their border and then seeking to convert the most sensitive spot on their border, which is Ukraine, into a member of that alliance. So of course they've reacted in this way.
So the part of the devil's advocacy that you're staking a stronger claim on, because I hear you today saying you just do not think Putin is an aggressor. I first of all have trouble understanding his motivations, but I wouldn't take that off the board that he's an aggressor because of the motivations that I laid out for you, to reestablish a sphere of influence, to give him some insulation, to create more protection for Russia. But then I would argue with the hawk, I would say, well, what is the American interest in a non-NATO country? Because, by the way, they'll take it straight to NATO. Like I said, well, do you think because he's trying to re-exert control in Lithuania or Belarus that he's going to invade Poland? And by the way, they'll say yes to that. But I draw a hard line at NATO. I mean, like, so my point is to them, like, what is the American interest in non-NATO countries? And here's an argument, for one, that they make. Well, when Ukraine, who is not a NATO country, gave up nukes after the fall of the Soviet Union, we made a tacit promise to them that we would protect them in case of invasion from Russia, and we'd be betraying that promise we made to Ukraine.
The Budapest Memorandum?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've read accounts of the Budapest Memorandum by some of the negotiators, and what they say is that it was not a security guarantee. It made some vague assurances, but it was absolutely not a guarantee. And if it were a guarantee of their security, it would have had to have been ratified by the U.S. Senate with a 2/3 majority, because that's the constitutional requirement. And of course, it wasn't, because neither Bill Clinton nor the president who preceded him, George H.W. Bush, thought that they could get Senate approval of a treaty. So it is less than a treaty, is less than a security guarantee. It is a vague assurance. But Russia also signed up for that assurance. And the problem is that I guess that deal was signed in 1994, and it was simply superseded by all the events that happened subsequently. Remember that it's not just Russia that violated that deal. If you look at the Minsk agreements, which were signed in 2015 and were supposed to be operative from 2015 through 2021, Ukraine signed on to that deal, and Ukraine did not keep up its end of the bargain. So look, there's a history here of agreements, and this is a conflict between these two countries. I personally don't think the U.S. should be setting itself up as the arbitrator of these disputes between Russia and Ukraine. But more to the point, if we had never gotten involved, there would be no war today.
Because if we had never gotten involved in what? In the
I mean,
initial
again,
invasion?
we keep pretending here that Putin is the aggressor and did this for no reason because we want to exculpate our own involvement. This was not an unprovoked invasion. The Russians made manifestly clear since 2008 that it was completely unacceptable to them for Ukraine to join NATO. And yet we insisted on continually pushing to bring Ukraine into NATO. That was the central provocation. In addition to that, we had that New York Times story recently that said that the CIA had set up secret bases in Ukraine for a decade, since 2014, that were engaged in spying on Russia, on identifying targets within Russia, and training Ukrainian assassination squads. I mean, these are things that if the Russians set up in Mexico or Canada, we would definitely consider them a security threat. We have the U.S. involvement in color revolutions in their backyard. I mean, first you had the Rose Revolution in 2003 in Georgia. You had the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine. That didn't work. So then we backed a coup in Kiev in 2014, the Maidan revolution or coup. So it's the U.S. that's been constantly meddling and interfering in their backyard. And I guess the question I would have for these hawks is, if you don't think Russia should have a sphere of influence in its own neighboring countries through which it's been attacked throughout history, why should the U.S. have a sphere of influence in those countries? I mean, this is the neocon position, is that no other great power except us shall have a sphere of influence, and the U.S. sphere of influence shall be the entire world. I mean, that's basically the position they set forth.
Well, okay, so my position on this, I'm leaving behind some devil's advocacy, which I'll pick up in just a moment, is as an American, what am I supposed to care if Russia is attempting to reestablish a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe? And the answer to that is, well, I'm supposed to care when it affects NATO, because NATO is an agreement America has signed up for. And I think your point is well taken on the Budapest Memorandum and everything that's happened since then that makes whatever agreements we had with Ukraine less than NATO. But the argument, so I had Senator Mark Wayne Mullen on the show about this, okay? So I'm America first. That's the bottom line. You know, and I don't feel like any need to apologize for the idea that foreign policy should be predicated upon whether or not something is good or bad for America. And I don't think it needs to be equal. I don't believe that it needs to be fairness. You know, to your question, I don't care if America has a sphere of influence everywhere and they don't allow anyone else to, as long as it serves America. And I've had trouble understanding why Ukraine serves America. Like, the outcome of this war, why is it important to your average American out there? Mullen's argument to me, David, was, and this is a little bit, this at least is something that I can understand. Like, Trump says when we won the war in Iraq, we should have taken the oil. I get that. You fight a war, you benefit from the spoils of war. That's how it works. That's how it's worked throughout history. I don't care if it's fair. I think it's just how it works. And we're Americans. And his argument is, well, Ukraine is rich in resources and minerals, and we need those for America, not for Russia.
We have all the minerals that we need, and they're a lot closer to home, and we can get them without provoking World War III with Russia. So I don't really get that argument. America is now energy independent. And if you want to get more access to oil and natural gas, just make it easier to drill and frack.
And
it makes no sense to be pursuing.
Well, it's not oil. I mean, oil is a big one in Ukraine, but I think they reference other like precious
They have
minerals.
farmland. So they have farmland.
Well, don't they have a lot of precious minerals that are needed in your area of the world? I mean,
we could get them through trading.
Yeah.
You know, in fact, it'd be a lot easier to obtain them if there was no war going on and they were simply available on the open market and we could buy them.
This is why I'm sympathetic to your point of view. No, I really am, but I don't think it's worthwhile to sit there and go, "Oh, great argument, David."
No, I agree. Throw the fastballs. Let's go.
Well, the problem is you've got a pitcher in there who's trying to throw somebody else's pitchers. I need to get a real neocon in here with you. Um, so, so where was I going to go? You messed me up, David, by making me just not think ahead, just be in the moment there for a moment.
Well, I think I think that this question of sphere of influence. I want to really stress that what the Russians were looking for in some of these sensitive border countries was neutrality. It's true they want a buffer zone, but that doesn't mean that they're trying to subjugate those peoples. They've had enough experience with that, and it hasn't gone well. And the thing that the line that these people always point to is that Putin said in some speech that anyone who doesn't miss the Soviet Union has no heart. But the immediate next sentence in that speech was, anybody who thinks we can get it back has no brain. He understands that, even if the fall of the Soviet Union from the Russian point of view was a tragedy, he understands it's not realistic to reconstitute it. He's made that abundantly clear. And it wouldn't be in Russia's interest. I mean, here's the thing is we don't really have to trust what's in his head, because I agree to some degree it's simply unknowable, but it wouldn't be in Russia's interest to try to reconstitute the Soviet Union. It would just create a lot of trouble for them. Again, what they're interested in here is secure borders. And if the U.S. wasn't trying to bring its military alliance right up to Russia's border, if it wasn't staging coups and color revolutions, if it wasn't basically putting nukes or the threat of nukes and American troops, weapons, and bases directly on Russia's border, I don't think we'd have a conflict with them. Fundamentally, Russia wants to focus on its internal problems. And we've prevented them from doing that by creating all of these security threats for the last 20 years. And now we finally find ourselves in the place that all the experts predicted when this debate over NATO expansion started in the 1990s. We are in a war via proxy with Russia. This was completely predicted. You can look at the historical record of the debates. You could look at the press coverage, even in 2021, and it was really clear that we were violating Russian red lines. And yet, the minute the war started, everyone pretended like there hadn't been this 25-year-old debate, and they just went with this whole unprovoked invasion narrative.
So I know where I was gonna go with you, and this will probably be where I leave the end of Ukraine, because I want to save a minute for something you said recently on the All In podcast. But you've been tweeting that like the $61 billion that has just passed by Congress, and you brought up World War III a moment ago. And in the beginning, I think we all wondered, would this metastasize into nuclear conflict? But it's increasingly clear that the either intended, it doesn't matter if it's intended or not, but the outcome of this is a forever war. I mean, this is going to grind on forever. And it's readily apparent that the United States is going to keep funding it. And I guess in some cases could be happy to continue to fund this. You could argue for cynical reasons for the military industrial complex. You could argue for geopolitical reasons to keep Russia tied up in another Afghanistan for a while. But it does appear that this is a forever war. Whatever you want, there's no win or loss to be had on either side. And it's pretty shocking that you've got so many members of Congress waving Ukrainian flags, like all in. That's the hardest thing for me about this. It's like I think the American public's at 60% polling and kind of vague support for Ukraine, but Congress is like, the level of passion in Congress for this forever war is pretty shocking.
Yeah, I mean, you saw that with all the flag waving and the hootering and the hollering and the cheering. These same people do not see what's happening at the U.S. southern border as a pressing issue or a crisis. They do see what's happening on Ukraine's border as a crisis. And you heard there was that one Democratic congressman who said Ukraine's border is our border. These people see no national border to be defended, only an imperial border to be expanded. And Ukraine is the tip of the spear. It is the border of the empire. It is basically the border of NATO. And they are hell-bent on this imperial mission of expanding NATO, even if it means war with Russia. And that's where they've gotten us to.
Where do you think that
Now,
passion, David, where do you think that passion comes from? I mean, neocons before they were conservative were liberals. In the 70s, there was a change where the neocons became conservatives. A whole Irving Kristol wing of conservatism were literally liberals before, and they became conservatives under the banner of neocon. So I'm just trying to, like, my co-host on Fox and Friends, Pete Hegseth, he thinks that a lot of the passion is because Putin has become a proxy for Trump. Like, you always hear him talk about, Clinton says, Trump idolizes Putin, and that they can fight a war against Putin as their proxy Trump. What do you think is the source of this passion?
well, I think there's no question that our domestic politics spilled into foreign policy after 2016. I mean, in 2016, you had the Hillary Clinton campaign create that phony piece of opposition research, the Steele dossier, which was used to basically create a hoax that Trump was somehow a Russian agent. And then after Trump won that election, they needed an excuse for the incompetent campaign they ran. And so they continued with that hoax for years and years. And they kept attaching new ornaments to that, to that Christmas tree. So you had the whole Alpha Bank scam. You had the whole Hamilton 68 dashboard, which was a total fraud. That was the basis for thousands of stories that the Russians were involved in our politics. And even today, they say that Trump is a Russian agent. Anyone who follows Trump is a Russian agent. So there's no question, I think, that part of the hostility to Russia has been generated by our domestic politics, and that domestic politics is ultimately based on a fraud.
Yeah.
But I think there's also something deeper to it, which is that I think globalist is kind of a nice word for imperialist. I think that there are people, I think this is very common among the boomers. I think boomers basically view America, it's very deep in their conception of what America is. They see America as a globe-spanning empire. And they grew up after World War II. And that was a period of time where the US absolutely dominated the world in every possible way, militarily, politically, economically, industrially. The rest of the world was destroyed. And the US, in the words of Joe Biden recently, the US was not the most powerful country in the world. It was the most powerful country in the history of the world. There were no constraints. There were no limits. And then when the US finally won the Cold War and we became the sole superpower, I mean, wow, that really clinched their view that America should dominate and run the world. Now, we don't run it by directly administering these countries. We just regime change leaders we don't like. But after the unipolar moment, we then got deeply involved in these forever wars in the Middle East. We basically pushed NATO right up to Russia's border. There's, I think, a strong belief on the part of these people that the U.S. should be running the world, and that is what it means to be an American, is to be running this globe-spanning empire. It is not a view of America as a republic, but as an empire, as Pat Buchanan wrote so presciently about 25 years ago. And so I think there's something very deep in this. But I think the ordinary American does not care about this vision. They do not care about what's going on in Ukraine. It's not important to them that Ukraine become part of NATO. This is very much an elite view. I think the average American wants the lawmakers to focus on our southern border. They want them to focus on domestic priorities. But the elite is very wrapped up in this conception.
Do you think you're winning the argument, David? Like, you have a small focus group with, I don't care about X. You and I have had long conversations about X. I think it's a free marketplace of ideas, which I appreciate, but I don't think it's very reflective of a wider point of view. I actually like your sample size. And so when I ask you, do you think you're winning? Like, on the All In podcast, right? That's a diversity of views. I've seen Chamath kind of move in your, I don't want to call it your direction, but I've seen him move in a direction. Do you think you're winning?
Well, evidently not. I mean, the Congress just passed this, and you heard through all those speeches on the floor, they just keep repeating all the narrative hoaxes that underlie this war, that somehow this was an unprovoked invasion, and NATO expansion has absolutely nothing to do with it. At the same time, they call for Ukraine to become part of NATO. So it's totally contradictory. But in any event, I think that there are a lot more people who are starting to wake up to the reality that this is not an unprovoked invasion, that there's a deep history to the conflict. And of course, it's not just me. It's really it's really thinkers who are at the top of the influencer food chain, like Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs and
Mhm.
people like that, who I think have ultimately made a big difference. And I just try to help amplify their views so that, we can get out of this mess.
Well, you had this. I wanted to save a minute for this. You had an interesting take on the most recent episode of your podcast. I spent the morning talking about all these protests across college campuses. I think the biggest thing for me on this takeaway is that it's hard to separate the earnest college student who I don't think any point of view ever is totally devoid of some kernel of truth or legitimacy, right? I think you should probably listen to everything and find out if there's something in there. And but when it comes to these protests on college campuses, when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians, it's so wrapped up in, I think, in many cases, some obvious anti-Semitism. In other cases, direct support, at least rhetorically, for Hamas. There's also, by the way, some organizations behind all of this stuff as well, so it's not as authentic as you think. But that being said, you still had an interesting take where you said, by the way, even the earnest kids, David, I made the point this morning, they have to be understood through the prism of the education they've been getting through colleges for the past several decades, where they teach critical theory, and the only way they can see the world is through oppressor and oppressed. So they see Israel as oppressor, and they see Gaza and the Palestinians as the oppressed. But even through all that, you said, well, we're not going to fully understand the legitimacy of portions of this protest for quite some time. We're not going to understand it until time has passed in the same way we understood Vietnam War protesters.
Yeah. Well, I think that there are some similarities here of what Israel's doing in Gaza to Vietnam. The first is that that war appears to be a quagmire. You're up against a guerrilla force, the Hamas, that is deeply enmeshed with the local population, and I don't think they can really tell who's Hamas and who's a civilian in the same way that we really couldn't tell who was Viet Cong and who was a Vietnamese civilian. So you have this really difficult situation where they're up against a guerrilla force that those guerrillas are using tactics like ambushes and booby traps and snipers. So it's not like Israel wants to have a lot of troops in there, and they've pulled out their troops because they're targets. But because of this, I think that Israel is not going to be able to achieve its military objective, which is regime change in Gaza. Again, the whole stated objective of Israel's invasion of Gaza was that they were going to destroy Hamas and they would change the government of Gaza so that it'd be administered by somebody else. And I just don't believe that objective is militarily attainable. I mean, we'll find out soon enough whether that is whether that's true or not. But you're already starting to hear a number of Israeli generals saying that the war in Gaza can degrade Hamas, but it can't defeat it. So I think that's the issue that Israel has.
All right, last, we have Tesla earnings tonight. You can give us any insight? You got to know something, David.
I don't. I make it a point not to ask Elon about stuff like that.
Make it a point, huh?
I don't need any trouble with the SEC.
I guess we'll all find out tonight. Tesla earnings come out. All right, David. I'm sure I did a poor job of attempting to play devil's advocate and steelman the argument, because I do have so many natural agreements with you when it comes to skepticism towards the war in Ukraine. But I appreciate you entertaining it, and it was great to talk to you again.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks, Will.
All right.